diverse during the conversation today, both from our distinguished guests and our colleagues from OIKONET. What we're going to do in no particular order, really. Those are the key issues that we thought are important. We may be able to discuss some, but not all. But what we're going to do is that we're going to take this with us, and we're going to reflect on them over the next few months to see if some of these can be a topic of exchange of ideas or activities, pedagogical activities or otherwise, or even research. I think our current message is really to bridge the gap between the three important elements that it has, which is the research, the pedagogy, and the participation. So we have talked about some of these issues today, and I think if we can focus the discussion here from the panelists along those three aspects. For example, if we are going to talk about education, educating the future architects, urban designers, urban planners, how could we adapt this education to, for example, the reflective practitioner, the critical thinking, the education and training post-qualification. These are all key issues that we need to be aware of. So, if I start with the education of the future professionals, future architects, future urban designers, future planners, in this context of urban transformations, how we should frame, especially in the context of the UK, where redesigning the architecture education. At the moment, as we speak, revising the education system of students in line with the Bologna Agreement and so on, but also responding to the needs of the UK through the Architecture Education Board. So for us there is an opportunity now to maybe fine-tune the programs across the country. Also maintaining the link with the professional practice as has been for many years. So if we start with the education, do you see, I know we have the UK, we have the US and Canada. What matters, what is important in terms of the topic of this conference, urban transformations, regenerations, and so on, around the housing?
Can I start?
Yes, go.
For those who weren't here yesterday, I am the inspector that Richard referred to earlier on. Does it make any difference? I've come here as a project evaluator on the OIKONET project, which has been an amazing and fascinating experience. So when I hadn't been evaluating, I've been getting very inspired and excited about the future of architectural education because I've just moved to a new job at the University of Reading School of Architecture, where we're starting a brand new school. And I'm also the chair of the Royal Institute of British Architects Research and Innovation Group, and I'm active on their education committee. So Karina's right, we're at a real point where we can begin to try to redesign education. And I took many notes going through lots of people's talks about the things that we should be thinking about in designing education for the future. And for me, it should be an education which is education for uncertainty. I asked Richard a beastly question about how we educate for uncertainty, but I think that's what we absolutely have to do. And I've talked, my evaluating job rather, has involved lots of very pleasant discussions over dinner, breakfast, lunch, with lots of you thinking about what education might be in this context. And some of the notes I've written is, and the things that struck an impression on me were things like the end result of projects are not determined. Talked with people over there in Sweden, working with no marks, just pass, fail. So because questions of what is good and what is bad are really problematic, and limit experiment. I love this idea of what if. Educating for what if, for the city in flux, and reflecting on the orthodoxy. And really as well, as we've really got to get the message out there that architects design processes and systems as well as buildings. So being as how I'm in charge of history theory, I'm sorry this is very practical, I'm going to be in charge of the history theory curriculum, it sorted it all out for me. Yesterday we brainstormed what a really great housing module might constitute. And so I've got all the lectures sorted out from that. Thank you very much, everybody. Participatory action research is what I'm doing here. But I really think that we need modules about what is the orthodoxy of practice, what is practice as it's happening now, and then moving on to future practice and how practice might be. Housing has to be covered, and I think most important of all, we need to teach research methods, because we really need to be able to develop a very clear evidence base for what it is we do, the value of what we do, and also research methods help. The language of research is a universal language that cuts right across disciplines, and I think that's one of the reasons it's so very, very fundamental. So I mean, one of the things for me in this conference has been looking out for places of hard evidence, evidence that policymakers, governments might listen to. And I have to say that there hasn't been a great deal of it, but that doesn't surprise me because it's the same everywhere. So for me, one of the constituents of a future architectural education is developing the research methodologies of practice. And I quite like, I did like one of the things that you said, Asim, about designing the design process. Because I'm trying to, because architects don't like the word research, so you have to find another way of putting it that's a bit more palatable. So I think that the agenda of architectural education should be research-led, evidence-based, but also keeping that element of creativity. And this is this wonderful tension that we, as architects, sit upon. So I have to thank you for giving me all these fantastic ideas, actually. Well, I thought they were fantastic.
I'd just like to add a little bit, if I could. Is it on?
Yes, it is.
I mean, I think architectural education is always seductive, and architecture students are always very fulfilling and very, very exciting in what they do. At least they usually are in most schools. And it is amazing that it doesn't matter where you are in the world, they're much the same. And there's some quality in there that I think is very important. But one of the quotations I like, a very short quotation from Michael Polanyi, the philosopher-chemist, is that even scientists work from computation to intuition and back again. And I think that there is an intuitive part of architectural education, and that's actually probably belittling it a bit, but it is that creative, intuitive, impulsive, anything goes part of the education that does have a huge amount to offer for unforeseen futures. But at the other end, unless we have the sort of backbone to that education that comes through expertise and knowledge of a whole variety of things. And I don't, there was a discussion, wasn't really had, but a couple of views expressed that I don't believe architects should study economics in great detail. But on the other hand, it's very simple. You can teach somebody in half a day to understand how developers and financiers look at the feasibility of schemes. And it's hugely useful to know that, because you can see where you can put value in that they will appreciate. And there's a lot of really hard-nosed stuff that I think architects need to know to balance and to not constrain, but actually to facilitate the more creative elements.
Yeah, I think it's a wonderful place to start, because most of us are educators. We're very passionate about it. We love, I second what Rachel said, it's wonderful working with students. Maybe I can speak to your point through two personal experiences. I did my undergraduate in architecture in India. I got my master's in France in architecture, and then I got my PhD in the US. So I was thinking about this the title of our conference is Global Dwelling. Everybody here is from across Europe, and you work all over the world. So are there sort of global patterns we can look at? And two things right away came to mind in terms of education. One is, I think our education is not critical enough. I'll give you a simple example. When I was studying in India, we studied the history of Indian architecture with a book, the same name by Bannister Fletcher. It was only about 10 years later I realized what an absolutely colonial and condescending approach it was. Yet generations of Indian architects have been inculcated in this ridiculously colonial, condescending view of their own history. And so, and I've seen that in other places also, like I questioned even when I was doing my master's, why are we keep obsessing about Nice and Le Corbusier, which is fine, and why don't we study these other sort of people, other forms of creating architecture? And so one of the things we tried was to invent a new course, what I call histories of urbanisms. To say, first of all, there's not one history and there's never one subject. And it was an experimental case where we studied it and we critiqued it. And I wasn't sure how it would go, and it was fantastic. The students loved it. Again, if you challenge students and support them, they will rise to the occasion. So it's not just feeding them the history, it's talking about the history and questioning it. Like, who wrote this and why? Why are we studying this and not that? Why are we only studying spectacular monumental buildings and not others? And who produced it? So what is this discourse? How is the narrative of the history of architecture constructed, and what are alternatives? And we tried it several times and it's worked very well. So kind of even the studio pedagogy, teaching the studio and critiquing it at the same time. And there are different ways of doing it. You don't have to go too much in depth. You don't have to confuse the students, but kind of the self-awareness of that. The second is about kind of moving the field forward. And I find that in many cases we look at the profession to alumni, which I think we are very careful about. I've taught at several different universities. Each one of them has alumni council and they come in. And no disrespect, I'm an alumni, but these are incredibly dull discussions. It's sort of a discussion, let's have a whole semester of real estate finance. Let's have a whole semester of the politics of cities. This sort of list making, this is the sort of the 8-year masters or 8-year, from 2 years to 8 years. So I think we're very cautious that looking to the profession for innovation in education, I'm not sure there are other sources for that. Now I understand that there are institutional constraints, there are professional constraints, so it's a lot of hard work. So the lesson here I'm going to share with you is sort of what you're going through. We started a brand new program at Parsons in New York, and we called it urbanism. We did not call it urban design because of the baggage. The baggage, at least in the US, is, if I may put it simply, is urban design is architecture only at a bigger scale. And it's not any of those things we've been talking about in this conference. And there was a big institutional fight where there was a whole group of people who wanted there were 3 new urbanism programs, urban ecologies, urban practice, and urban design, to be in the architecture department. And I was one of the people who said no. And the other urban programs, urban policy, we said no to that. So we were in an interdisciplinary department called Department of Design Strategies, and I'm so glad we fought that hard fight. It really helped us to start from scratch. As it turns out, most of us were trained as architects, but we were self-aware and self-critical enough to understand that we can't just desperately hang on to something we were taught, and that's what we should teach our students. So I think being able to be, and it's not easy, I know, to be self-critical and realizing what our own limitations are and what this future really means. So in short, we set up this program which, of course has its growing pains, it's not easy, is now, they're doing very well. It's, to summarize, I would say it's very critical, very interdisciplinary. We look at issues of space and form, but in very different ways. So for example, we look at space and form in our studios, not just as the end result, but as a means for other kinds of things that we've talked about and that are on this list.
Your second point there about interdisciplinary thinking, which is increasingly important nowadays for the profession. Now, if we talk about item 4, that is about the participation, how to organize housing community and establish strategic alliances to enable housing transformations. I mean, you all mentioned it to some degree during the presentations, and I think Flora has substantial experience from the library at Sheffield, when we were at Sheffield and so on. If you could tell us, or give participation group work package, what strategies are there, what tips are there to mobilize these communities and make them part of the team?
Wow. Where do we begin on this? I mean, I think perhaps a good place to start is with some excellent precedents, like, for example, AAA's urban scheme in Paris, which is currently in danger of being flattened and replaced by a multi-storey car park. Please put in your name on the signature. But there is a wonderful case where community working with architectural practice, working with research in a really virtuous cycle, a really productive cycle of knowledge. And I think, I mean, housing communities will only be able to do these things if they have resources, ultimately. So we have to fight for the resources. And it comes back, I think, again to architects being able to communicate with policymakers, people with money, I think it was mentioned how you transform well-being value into financial value. I think this becomes really key. And in many schools of architecture, people are stuck designing allotment gardens or composting toilets. This is my experience in the UK. There are a lot of these things going on, working at a very, very small scale. But we really have to up the ambition and to show that the knowledge and learning, even in a very micro project, is really profound and can be used globally, as is the case with the Urban project. So, participatory practice, in my experience, is extremely difficult. I have great respect for all the people who talked about projects today. When I was a housing architect, something would get built in the night, it would all be knocked down by the residents. Then we would build it again, and it would be knocked down by the residents the next day. So if you've got anything built that hasn't been knocked down by residents, I think you're really doing well. But we have to go on, and the only thing that we do know, the only real evidence we have about good housing practice and participatory work is that participation does work, and involving people in the designs of their own homes is unequivocally good for well-being, happiness, autonomy, everything. So we've got to get very canny at making that argument and turning arguments of participation into fashionable new arguments like health. Health is becoming a very popular subject in Britain, and now housing is seen as a major health issue, trying to save money on the national health system and so on. So we have to be clever about evidence, and we have to not be parochial, we have to be very ambitious, very rigorous, and very international and collaborative, I think.
My experience with participatory projects is that you have to be good at it. You don't have to be any particular discipline, and you can help people to be good at it. But the best participatory animators that I know, one is a landscape architect and I suppose urban designer. Another one had a degree in geography, and I can't remember the third. But there has also, I think, at one time, I think you made reference to participation in the 80s, the 60s, and certainly I remember it at the end of the 60s, through the 70s, and it still lingered in some places in the 80s, although the Thatcher government made it quite difficult. And what happened then, there were big projects in Liverpool where housing co-ops were formed in the face of being moved on. There was the experiment that I think I might have referred to in Oxford, where Oxford City invited some tenants to participate in the development of their own housing. And in all those cases, first of all, the people that facilitated it, the people that actually made it happen, were acting more as client negotiators and educators of the participating residents. And the other thing that happened in most cases was that there was a tremendous linkage between a group that had achieved something through participation. For a long time, the people in BICA were on call for all sorts of projects. The Liverpool cooperative tenants were on call, and they certainly came to Oxford and told them how they'd done it. And I think those networks are important. And what happened in the School of Planning at, I think it must have been Oxford Brookes by that time, was that they set up a programme with funding from the UK Institute of Housing to part-time educate tenants into becoming tenant participation enablers. Sadly, I think the programme is no longer there. But that was hugely important in creating networks. And I think you find in some countries, I know in Brazil there are networks of people who've been involved in urban regeneration, and certainly Peru has a long history of that. So I think we need to think about it as something that if it presents itself as an issue, then you have to look hard and wide. But there are people who can give you a start, and there are ways of actually developing the necessary skills, but not necessarily by architects, who will always have an interest, I think, in how the form, regardless of the changing world, will end up.
Yeah, I'd like to build on previous comments that yes, I think we should study examples of successful community participation. In addition, I think we need to move away from this dichotomy of yes, community participation, no community participation. Actually, there are different types of community participation. Community participation is very contextual. It's cultural, whether you're working with an immigrant group, a middle-class group, a low-income group. So, for example, the excellent question I think that you asked about why I think community participation sort of didn't catch on as a global movement everywhere. One, having done a lot of community participation, is the logistics. It's exhausting. Community participation is usually done with lower income populations, many of whom have 3 or 4 jobs. And I know because we would have these meetings in the evening. I remember we were doing a project in Detroit, and they were like, really? So many meetings? And so we assume that, they have very busy, heavy lives. And what happens very often, and I see this in other cases also, you go through this very exhausting, hard work of community participation, and what results is a small community garden or a little housing project. So they begin to see the trade-off, and they say, well, so I think we need to differentiate different types of community participation, different degrees, look at context, and why does it always demand so much from lower income populations? And we don't ask rich people to do community participation, we don't usually ask. Sometimes, of course, we ask middle class or middle class people. So look at the context, look at different types and strategies for community participation. The other thing is, I think we have to look at what is the largest structure within community that community participation occurs within. So now I'm working on a book on Las Vegas. It's not learning from Las Vegas, but it's understanding how a city is actually designed. And it's sort of a gentle critique of critical urban theory of Henri Lefebvre and Neil Brenner, which are, they're fantastic theories, but they're very general. And what I'm trying to contribute to the discussion is 2 things. One is to say we should theorize from empirical evidence. However brilliant their observations are about capitalism and urbanism, but how does it actually work? And if you begin to actually look at empirical evidence, you find it works very differently in city by city. But the larger contribution I'm hoping to make, again empirically, is city design and building is a huge juggernaut. If you look at the millions and millions of dollars and euros in capital that flows through cities, you begin to understand the context within which community participation works. That it's this huge power structures, whether it's economic power, political power, and then understanding how that works. So I think empirical research of how cities are actually designed and built will help us understand better how to be more strategic and effective with community participation. And this comes back to the earlier point about learning from successful ones. Some of the most successful large-scale community participation tend to be coalitions across different groups rather than just one little group, which again can be very successful in doing small projects, but I think we want to be a little more ambitious, especially when it comes to housing. So building these kinds of large political coalitions in the face of this what I call the huge juggernaut of city design and building processes and structures.
Jim?
I'd just like to comment on something that seems said twice about educating architects in like wider issues of economy, and that it would take an 8-year degree. I do think that's a big exaggeration. Even to get a 5-credit module onto a master's course would be a help, I think, in widening their scope and their understanding of if you like, the systems that operate around housing. So I do think we could start small, and the architects would get a lot from it. Graduates would get a lot from that. So I don't think it's such a big issue. I think what's missing is the will, and there is a strong belief that architects need to be educated in a particular way. Jeremy Till has written very well about this and critiqued it, taking his cue from Rainer Bannon's last essay, Black Box. So I think we have to argue to get out of that and to do more participating design is one thing, but also just to talk about political economy and its impact on architecture, particularly on housing.
Yeah, I'm sorry if I sounded dismissive. Actually, I meant the institutional approach of saying let's have for each topic a separate course, which is a big problem. But I entirely agree with you. So for example, when we teach housing studios, we do exactly what you said. Within the studio, we spend, again, not a lot of time looking at, again, maybe in a neighborhood or our site, why is housing the way it is? So kind of a mini political economy of that place, as they're doing other research of typologies and precedents and so forth. So actually, I entirely agree with you, and that taking that to the next level, given sometimes the institutional challenges of introducing innovation, we can do a lot of innovation within our classes, also as individual teachers on a very immediate level, without having to go through. We should do larger changes, but that's something I think we can do right away.
Thank you. Jen?
My question is about the reason why system participation disappeared. Yeah? So I think that maybe one reason why it disappeared and not came back after the 60s and 70s might be that it didn't succeed in changing systems. So I wonder if you could, perhaps from your perspectives, comment what systems do you think system participation in planning and design should change? What kind of systems are we talking about?
Okay, I come back to a point that Asine made, I think, which is that it seems to me that the reason that participation disappeared in many parts of the world in the 1980s in particular was to do with Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, and the great globalisation of the economies. And it is a fact that not only do we ask too much, and I'm glad you made the point of groups that maybe have no cash, so we say, you've got to come to meetings, and certainly in the most intense program that I ever worked with, we have to constantly make sure that we have different meetings at different times so that different people are under different pressures. Notably mothers with children who couldn't make a lot of times. And I have to say, as an aside, in my experience in participatory exercises or projects, it's usually the women that take the lead in the end. But that may be just my particular experience. But the other thing about it is that it is very expensive in terms of the professional input that you get. And if it works, it usually takes much longer than a normal, it will inevitably take much longer than a normal design process where you get what you're given. And in some not quite related research that we did out of Greenwich, which was not specifically to do with housing, it was to do with the regeneration of a relatively badly extended what we discovered was that the initiative to try and drive that forward had faltered. And everybody thought it had faltered because there was no confidence from the developers in the local authority and vice versa. And the research that we did uncovered the fact that there was every confidence between them, but what they didn't understand was that the public sector didn't understand what the pressures were on the private sector. The planners didn't understand, the town planners didn't understand the pressures on the local hospital network in terms of when they could do things and how things had to be done and what the timescale was. So there was a whole matrix of public, private and institutional pressures. House builders, if they don't meet their targets in a year, they lose their job sometimes. It's very tough. Blood in a bucket, as somebody once described it to me. And so, anything that actually endangers them fulfilling their target will not get their attention. And it's like that right across. And so I think that's why we need people to understand those things. And my feeling is that architecture has always had the opportunity to be open-ended in education. Not so much in practice, but in education. And in England, although we're going to rejig it all, the last rejigging, which had a very detailed matrix of what architecture students had to achieve to come out at the end, gave the opportunity for some schools to have what did they call it?
Specialisms.
Well, there's a project, the compliance project. Some of the more ambitious and creative schools had a compliance project where they met all the criteria for being pretty much for becoming accredited in one big project. And then they could do what they liked in the rest of the time. Now, many schools adopted, certainly at Greenwich we had a system, we didn't have a compliance project, we had an elaborate matrix. But it meant that most of our project work could be open-ended. There wasn't a requirement. We worked with housing estates that needed to be refurbished. We worked with areas of towns that needed to be reconfigured. And we considered as much as we could of the various stakeholders. And I think giving that opportunity to student architects so that they then understand when they go into practice that it isn't just participation, it isn't just working across the disciplines, it's understanding the institutional pressures so that you can actually make something that gives something to everybody. And at one level, that's often providing a profit for private sector organisations, but getting a public good out of it at the same time. Sorry, it's a bit rambling, but I feel quite passionate about it.
Just quickly, I completely agree with you about systems. Ultimately, that's what it's about. But what's interesting is actually some of the most innovative work is coming out of the global south. I'll give you an example. Like Brazil is probably the world's leading place for participatory budgeting at the municipal level. This was started by the city of Porto Alegre now about more than 15 years ago. And basically what they do is they take part of the budget, is still a big chunk, and they have a process by which thousands of people can decide where to go. And a very interesting thing happened in the city of Belo Horizonte in Brazil. They voted for the major chunk of that to go to the poorest parts of the city, which is extraordinary. This would never happen in New York, for example. Citizens of New York saying, let's pour millions of dollars into the Bronx, etc. So what's the connection with architecture? The connection is very complex. And what came out of this, I looked at one project, was a wonderful in Aglomerado da Serra, this project which included housing, a park, a community center. And the community center is beautifully designed, it's stunning, and a local architect who I interviewed did a fantastic job. A local ecologist did the park with community participation. Unfortunately, what failed was the housing part because it was given over to a construction company who cut corners and who kind of built this awful thing. So it's not perfect, but it's there. So this notion of participatory budgeting, which actually other cities and countries around the world are looking at, is, at least at the municipal level, a systemic way of trying to make it, rather than just a few small projects here and there, kind of more at the municipal scale. Even with its flaws, I think it's something worth looking at.
I just would like to just add one thing. I think that participatory architecture never went away. And there have been some fantastic practitioners who kept to their values and have carried on doing participatory architecture all the way through. But just to add to Richard's point, in the UK, 50%, I think 50% of architects, something like that, were employed by government departments, and they were able to do participatory work, and they had a kind of ethical standard for the public good. And that's what Mrs. Thatcher did away with, is the public architects. So all architects are now pretty much commercial entities and working commercially. So we have to make participatory architecture commercial. It has to work and make good financial sense. So I do keep coming back to standards and systems of proving that participatory architecture actually does some really very serious good. I mean, and participatory architecture, something that also died at that time, or appeared to die, was the relationship between social sciences and the architectural profession. It's something that I'm charting in my own research, which is really very interesting. And I think it was linked to slightly crude research methodologies that there were existing in the 1980s and 70s. But now social science research methodologies have become so sophisticated and so blended with architecture methodologies. There's a real opportunity to produce a very subtle and exciting form of evidence that what we're talking about here really does matter.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you for I think I'll call Leandro here to say a few acknowledgements and close the conference.
Okay. Well, it's my case or Henrik, we have another
Thank you.
I think it's a real privilege to have a discussion like this here. I hope that you realize what it means. Hopefully all this discussion here will be broadcasted to the web portal, and the issues that we discussed here, with your permission, I think we'll have a larger audience. So I would like to thank everybody who attended until the last minute here, in particular again to the people who organized all the infrastructure, our colleagues here in the Faculty of Architecture and the Slovak Technical University, Viera Joklova and Henrik Rivkov. Many thanks. So our next challenge will be 1 year. So we have a big challenge now. Karim will solve all the problems. In 1 year we'll have a wonderful conference with at least 500 participants and 100 papers. That's a challenge. So we'll hopefully we'll meet in 1 year. It will be the closing of the OIKONET project, and hopefully we'll do more work and more ideas to be discussed. So we meet in 1 year.
Well, shortly for the conclusion, I would like also to thank all participators, all presenters for their inspiring sharing their expertises and experience with us. I would like to thank for the participation and presentation of two keynote speakers, Professor Richard Hayward and Professor Hassan Inam, as well the external evaluator of the project, Professor Flora Samuel. I would like to express great thanks to our coordinator of this project, OIKONET and all project participants and participants to this conference. Special thanks I would like to express to our Dean, Professor Luisa Vitkova, who helped us and support this event at our faculty, and also to all my colleagues who helped me and for your satisfaction in this event. Finally, I would like to invite all you for the opening of the exhibition, which is installed in our foyer, and it will be opened by my colleague Juraj Fudík. You can have a small refreshment there as well, with a glass of wine. And I propose to make there a common final photograph with the participants of this conference. And the last words for today from me is for those who will participate tonight at dinner. We will show you with Henrik the way to the restaurant. Yes. Second information is for those who will participate on tomorrow meeting of OIKONET. So we will start at 8 in the room 117. Yeah. And hopefully we will finish at 10 o'clock. And then we will start the last event, and it is the excursion around Bratislava. Yeah, so that's all from me. Thank you.